The gunshot that shattered the morning calm of Silver Ridge, Colorado wasn't meant for Eleanor Hartwell, but she refused to duck. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside Brennan's general store, with her chin raised and her green eyes blazing, watching two drunken miners fire their pistols into the air while the rest of the town scrambled for cover like frightened rabbits. It was August of 1876, and Eleanor had been in this rough mining settlement for exactly 3 months, long enough to know that showing fear was the fastest way to lose respect. "Miss Hartwell, get inside," old Mr. Brennan hissed from his doorway, his weathered face creased with worry. Eleanor didn't move. She adjusted the heavy crate of supplies in her arms and waited for the miners to exhaust their ammunition before she crossed the dusty street to where her wagon waited. Her dark auburn hair, pinned in a severe bun at the nape of her neck, caught the morning sunlight as she walked with deliberate, unhurried steps. The miners noticed her then, their laughter fading as they took in her unflinching composure. "Well, now ain't she something," one of them muttered, but Eleanor didn't spare them a glance. She loaded her supplies into the wagon bed with efficient movements, her calico dress practical and worn from hard use. The fabric had seen better days, but Eleanor kept it clean and mended. Pride wasn't about fancy things. It was about holding your head high no matter what life threw at you, and life had thrown plenty at Eleanor Hartwell. "That woman is too proud for her own good," Mrs. Adelaide Perkins announced loudly from across the street, her ample bosom heaving with indignation. She stood with 2 other town matrons, their faces pinched with disapproval. "Mark my words, that pride will be her downfall. No woman should run a homestead alone. It isn't natural." Eleanor heard every word. She was meant to, but she simply climbed onto her wagon seat, released the brake, and clicked her tongue to set her 2 horses moving. Let them talk. She'd heard worse in the 3 years since her father died, and left her with nothing but a half-finished homestead claim and enough debt to drown in. The trail leading out of Silver Ridge wound through stands of aspen and pine, climbing steadily into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Baz Eleanor's homestead sat in a small valley 5 miles from town, isolated enough to give the gossips plenty to whisper about. A woman alone, they said. Unnatural, improper, inviting trouble. What they didn't know was that Eleanor had already survived the worst trouble life could offer. Her mother had died when she was 12, leaving her to care for her younger brother Thomas, while their father drank himself into an early grave. Thomas had died of fever 2 winters past, and Eleanor had buried him in the frozen ground with her own hands because she couldn't afford a proper burial. After that, the whispers of small-minded townspeople seemed like nothing more than the buzzing of distant insects. The homestead came into view as she crested the final rise. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney her father had constructed during one of his sober periods. Eleanor had chinked the gaps herself, added shutters to the windows, and built a modest barn for her horses and the 3 milk cows she was slowly accumulating. The vegetable garden showed neat rows of growing things, testimony to her determination to make this land productive. She was unloading supplies when she felt the prickling awareness of being watched. Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to the rifle she kept propped near the wagon, but she didn't grab it, not yet. Instead, she continued working while scanning the tree line with peripheral vision. A massive figure emerged from the pines, moving with surprising quiet for someone so large. Eleanor's breath caught despite herself. The man stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms thick with muscle visible beneath his buckskin shirt. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, hung past his shoulders, partially obscuring a face that looked carved from the same stone as the mountains themselves. A thick beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, pale blue like glacial ice, studied her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You're trespassing," Eleanor said, proud that her voice remained steady. She didn't reach for the rifle, but she shifted her weight slightly, ready to move if necessary. The mountain man stopped about 20 feet away. This close, Eleanor could see the way his buckskin pants hugged powerful thighs and the way his chest strained against his shirt with each breath. He carried a rifle with casual ease, as if the weapon weighed nothing. Everything about him radiated raw, masculine strength. "Creek runs through your property," he said. His voice was deep, rough from disuse, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Been using this trail to reach it for 5 years. Didn't figure the old man would mind, seeing as he never said otherwise. The old man is dead, Eleanor replied. I'm Eleanor Hartwell. This is my land now. Something flickered in those ice-blue eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. Heard tell someone was trying to work the Hartwell claim. Didn't realize it was a woman alone. What difference does that make? The corner of his mouth twitched beneath his beard, almost a smile, but not quite. None at all, I reckon. Name's Caleb Thorne. I live up in the high country, about 8 miles northwest. Come down for supplies once a month or so. Mr. Thorne, Eleanor nodded, filing away the information. You're welcome to use the trail to reach the creek, but I'd appreciate it if you'd announce yourself rather than lurking in the trees. Now he did smile, a flash of white teeth in his tanned face. Lurking? Ma'am, if I'd been lurking, you never would have known I was there. It was true, and they both knew it. The man moved like smoke through the forest, silent and sure. But Eleanor refused to back down. She crossed her arms and raised her chin. Nevertheless, this is my property. Common courtesy dictates making your presence known. Common courtesy, Caleb repeated, and there was something in his tone that made Eleanor's spine stiffen. Amusement, perhaps, or admiration. Yes, ma'am. I'll be sure to make more noise next time. He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a casual salute, then turned and melted back into the forest without another word. Eleanor watched him go, her heart beating faster than it should. She told herself it was simply the surprise of encountering a stranger, but she knew that was a lie. Something about Caleb Thorne had affected her in a way she couldn't quite name, something that went beyond the simple appreciation of masculine beauty. She shook her head sharply and returned to unloading her supplies. She didn't have time for foolish thoughts about mysterious mountain men, no matter how striking they might be. The garden needed weeding, the cows needed milking, and winter would come soon enough. In the high country, a person couldn't afford to be distracted. But that night, she lying in her narrow bed with moonlight streaming through the cabin window, Eleanor found her thoughts returning to pale blue eyes and a voice like distant thunder. She fell asleep trying to remember the last time someone had looked at her the way Caleb Thorne had, as if her pride was something to be admired rather than condemned. The next time Eleanor saw Caleb was 2 weeks later, and the circumstances were considerably less pleasant. She was working in her garden in the early morning, enjoying the cool air before the August heat settled in, when she heard horses approaching, multiple riders, moving fast. Eleanor straightened, shading her eyes against the rising sun. 4 men rode into her yard, their horses kicking up dust and trampling the edge of her garden. Eleanor's jaw clenched as she recognized the leader, Silas Blackwood. Bees who owned the largest mining operation in the region, and seemed to think that gave him the right to do whatever he pleased. Miss Hartwell, Blackwood said, not bothering to dismount. He was a thick-bodied man in his mid-40s with graying hair and small, calculating eyes. I've come to make you an offer. I'm not interested, Eleanor replied immediately. This wasn't the first time Blackwood had approached her about buying her land, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Now don't be hasty, Blackwood said, his tone falsely jovial. You haven't even heard my offer, $1,000 for your claim. That's a generous sum for a woman in your position. My position? Eleanor's voice could have cut glass. And what position would that be, Mr. Blackwood? A woman alone trying to work land that's too much for her. It's not natural, Miss Hartwell. Everyone in Silver Ridge says so. Why struggle when you could take my money and move somewhere civilized, somewhere proper for a lady? Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides. My answer is no, Mr. Blackwood. This land belonged to my father, and now it belongs to me. I intend to keep it. Blackwood's expression hardened. The creek that runs through your property feeds into the watershed my mining operation depends on. I'm offering you a fair price, but I'm not asking forever. You'd do well to reconsider. The answer is no, Eleanor repeated, her voice firm. Now please remove your horses from my garden before they do any more damage. For a long moment, Blackwood simply stared at her, his eyes cold. Then he smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You're a proud woman, Miss Hartwell. Too proud, some might say. Pride can be dangerous in this country. Is that a threat? It's a friendly warning, Blackwood said. He yanked his horse's head around, causing the animal to sidestep and crush several bean plants. I'll be back when you've had time to think things through more carefully. Come on, boys." The four men rode out as recklessly as they'd arrived, leaving Eleanor standing amid the ruins of her garden bed with her heart pounding. She knew Blackwood's reputation. He was ruthless in his business dealings and wasn't above using intimidation to get what he wanted. But Eleanor had faced down worse than Silas Blackwood, and she'd be damned if she'd let him drive her off her own land. She was on her hands and knees, trying to salvage what she could of the trampled plants, when a shadow fell across her. Oh, Eleanor looked up sharply, reaching for the small knife she kept at her belt, but relaxed when she saw Caleb Thorne standing at the edge of the garden. "Making noise like you asked," he said, though Eleanor hadn't heard him approach, despite supposedly trying to be loud. "Saw Blackwood and his men leaving. They give you trouble." "Nothing I can't handle," Eleanor said, returning her attention to the damaged plants. She could feel Caleb watching her, his gaze steady and assessing. "He wants your land," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "He wants the creek," Eleanor corrected. "His mining operation is upstream. He's worried about water rights." Caleb was silent for a moment. Then he crouched down beside her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped lift a crushed tomato plant. This one might make it if you stake it proper." Eleanor glanced at him in surprise. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. He was older than her by perhaps a decade, maybe 32 or 33, though it was hard to tell. The mountain had weathered him in a way that transcended simple age. "Thank you," she said quietly, accepting the plant. Their fingers brushed, and Eleanor felt a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. They worked together in silence for nearly an hour, salvaging what they could and clearing away the damaged plants beyond saving. Caleb moved with efficiency born of experience, and Eleanor found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. The muscles in his forearms flexed as he worked, bee tendons standing out beneath sun-darkened skin. His hands, though large and rough, handled the delicate plants with surprising care. "You know much about Silas Blackwood?" Caleb asked eventually, sitting back on his heels. "I know enough. He owns the Silver Creek mine and most of the smaller operations in the area. He has money and influence. He also has a reputation for getting what he wants, no matter what he has to do to get it." Caleb's pale eyes met hers directly. "You should be careful, Eleanor Hartwell." The use of her first name sent another small thrill through her, though she kept her expression neutral. "I can take care of myself, Mr. Thorne." "Caleb," he corrected, "and I don't doubt you can. But there's a difference between being capable and being reckless. Pride can get a person killed in this country." Eleanor's spine stiffened. "You sound like the town gossips." "No," Caleb said softly. "They criticize your pride. I'm saying I understand it. Takes a powerful amount of backbone to stand up to someone like Blackwood. Most men wouldn't have that kind of courage, let alone a woman alone." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the praise. "I'm not trying to be courageous. I'm trying to survive." "Same thing sometimes." Caleb stood, brushing dirt from his buckskin pants. "I meant what I said, though. Be careful. Blackwood's got a mean streak, and he doesn't like being told no." "I'll keep that in mind," Eleanor said, rising to face him. Even standing as tall as she could, the top of her head barely reached his shoulder. She had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes, a position she wasn't used to and wasn't entirely sure she liked. Caleb studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he nodded once and turned to leave, disappearing into the forest as silently as he'd come. Eleanor watched the trees long after he'd gone, wondering why his concern felt different from the town's disapproval, why his words about her pride sounded like admiration instead of criticism. She spent the rest of the day working harder than usual, as if physical labor could quiet the confusing tumult of her thoughts. But that night, lying in her bed with aching muscles and dirt still under her fingernails, Eleanor found herself thinking not about Silas Blackwood's threats, but about ice-blue eyes and hands gentle enough to save a broken tomato plant. September arrived with a cold snap that reminded everyone in the high country that winter was never far away, even in early autumn. Eleanor spent her days preparing for the lean months ahead, preserving vegetables, cutting hay, and making sure her cabin was properly sealed against the coming snows. It was hard, exhausting work, but she took satisfaction in each completed task. She saw Caleb 3 more times over the next few weeks. Each encounter seemed almost accidental, though Eleanor began to suspect he was keeping an eye on her property. Once she found him examining the tracks near her barn, his face grim. Another time he appeared while she was struggling to repair a section of her roof, and though she initially refused his help, he simply climbed up beside her and started working without another word. "You're stubborn," he said conversationally, hammering a shingle into place with powerful, efficient strikes. "So I've been told," Eleanor replied, refusing to acknowledge how much easier the work was with his help. "It's not an insult." Eleanor glanced at him, surprised. "Most people seem to think it is. Most people are fools." Caleb positioned another shingle, his shoulders flexing beneath his shirt. "Stubbornness keeps a person alive in this country. So does pride, if it's the right kind." "And what kind is that?" "The kind that makes you stand up when everything else says lie down. The kind that makes you keep fighting when fighting seems pointless." He looked at her then, and the intensity in his gaze made Eleanor's breath catch. "The kind you have." Something warm unfurled in Eleanor's chest. He's something dangerous and entirely inappropriate. She forced herself to look away, focusing on the shingles in her hands. "You don't know me well enough to make that judgment. I know you buried your father and your brother. I know you've been working this claim alone for 3 years against odds that would break most men. I know you stood up to Blackwood even though you must have been terrified." Caleb's voice was matter of fact, stating observations rather than offering empty flattery. "I know enough." "How do you know about Thomas?" Eleanor's voice came out sharper than she intended, defensive. "Small town. People talk, especially about the strange woman living alone in the foothills." Caleb finished securing the last shingle and sat back, surveying their work. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for your losses." Eleanor swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. Most people offered condolences that felt hollow, obligatory. Caleb's simple statement carried genuine sympathy without pity, acknowledgement without weakness. "Thank you." They climbed down from the roof in silence. Eleanor's legs trembled slightly from the strain of crouching for so long, and she stumbled on the last rung of the ladder. Caleb's hands caught her waist, steadying her with effortless strength. For a moment, Eleanor was acutely aware of the heat of his palms through her dress, the solid wall of his chest just inches behind her, the faint scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to him. "Careful," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Eleanor pulled away, her cheeks flushing. "I'm fine. Thank you for your help with the roof." If Caleb noticed her discomfort, he didn't comment. He simply nodded and retrieved his rifle from where he'd propped it against the cabin wall. "I'll check the perimeter before I head back. Saw some tracks yesterday that didn't sit right with me." "What kind of tracks?" "The human kind." Caleb's expression darkened. "Someone's been scouting your property, probably Blackwood's men, though I can't prove it. Keep your rifle close, Eleanor, and bar your door at night." The use of her first name had become natural between them, though Eleanor couldn't quite remember when the transition had occurred. She watched him disappear into the trees, her earlier warmth replaced by cold unease. The thought of someone watching her cabin, prowling around her property in the dark, made her skin crawl. That night, Eleanor kept her rifle loaded and propped beside her bed. She barely slept, starting at every creak and groan of the cabin settling, every whisper of wind through the pines. When dawn finally came, she rose exhausted but determined. She wouldn't let Blackwood's intimidation tactics drive her away. This was her land, her home, and she would defend it. She was feeding her chickens 2 mornings later when she heard the sound of breaking glass from inside the cabin. Eleanor dropped the feed bucket and ran, her heart pounding. The kitchen window had been shattered, and a rock the size of her fist lay amid the broken glass on the floor. A piece of paper was tied to it with crude twine. Eleanor's hands shook as she untied the paper and read the scrawled message. "Sell or suffer, last warning." Rage flooded through her, hot and fierce. She stormed outside, searching for any sign of the perpetrator, but saw nothing except fresh hoofprints leading away from the cabin toward the main trail. Whoever had thrown the rock had been on horseback and was long gone. Eleanor was still standing in her yard, clutching the threatening note, when Caleb appeared. He took one look at her face, at the paper in her hand, and his expression turned thunderous. "Let me see," he said quietly, and something in his tone made Eleanor hand over the note without argument. Caleb read it, his jaw clenching beneath his beard. This is beyond intimidation. This is a direct threat. I know what it is, Eleanor said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. But what can I do about it? I have no proof it was Blackwood. Even if I did, he owns half the law in Silver Ridge. You could leave, Caleb said, though his tone suggested he already knew what her answer would be. No. Eleanor's voice was flat, final. I won't let him drive me off my own land. My father and brother are buried here. This is my home. I won't abandon it. Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the distinct impression she was being measured against some internal standard. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. Then you'll need help defending it. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. Caleb's pale eyes were steady on hers. I don't have much use for bullies, and I have even less use for men who threaten women. If Blackwood wants to push, he'll find out what it's like when someone pushes back. Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. When was the last time someone had stood beside her instead of judging her from a distance? When had anyone offered help without expecting something in return? Why would you do this? You barely know me. I know you well enough, Caleb said, echoing his words from the roof. Besides, I told you before, I respect courage, and you've got it in spades. That's worth defending. Something shifted between them in that moment, some invisible line being crossed. Eleanor felt it in the sudden intensity of Caleb's gaze, in the way her pulse quickened when he stood close. This was dangerous territory, allowing herself to depend on someone, to trust someone. But as she stood there with broken glass in her cabin and threats hanging over her head, Eleanor realized she was tired of being alone. All right, she said quietly, but I won't hide behind you. If there's going to be a fight, I'll be standing right beside you. Caleb's expression softened into something that might have been a smile. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Eleanor Hartwell. They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin's defenses. Caleb showed Eleanor how to set simple snares and alarms around the perimeter that would alert her if someone approached in the night. He checked every window, every door, evaluating potential weak points with the eye of someone who'd spent years surviving in hostile territory. You've done this before, Eleanor observed, watching him work. Fought off claim jumpers and worse back when I was first establishing my own place, Caleb said. The mountain is beautiful. But it attracts all kinds. Some good, some not so much. Why did you come here? To Colorado, I mean. Caleb was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, I was a scout during the war. Afterward, I couldn't stomach being around people anymore. Too much death, too much ugliness. Came west looking for space to breathe, found it in the high country. Eleanor understood that impulse more than she could say. She'd chosen this isolated homestead partially for practical reasons, but also because she was tired of people's judgment, tired of their expectations. In the mountains, she could be herself without apology. And now, she asked, can you stomach being around people again? Caleb's ice-blue eyes met hers, and Eleanor saw something in them that made her breath catch. Yeah, it depends on the person. The air between them suddenly felt charged, electric. Eleanor found herself moving closer without conscious decision, drawn by something she didn't fully understand. Caleb stood very still, watching her approach, his expression unreadable. Eleanor, he said, and her name on his lips sounded like both a question and a warning. Thank you, she said quietly, stopping just inches from him. For everything. For not thinking I'm foolish or unnatural. For helping me. For understanding. There's nothing foolish about you, Caleb said, his voice rough, and if standing your ground makes you unnatural, then nature is overrated. Eleanor laughed, surprising herself. When was the last time she'd laughed? When was the last time someone had made her feel like laughing? She reached out impulsively and touched his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath his sleeve. You're a strange man, Caleb Thorne. So I've been told, he replied, and this time he definitely smiled. The moment stretched between them, warm and promising. Then Caleb stepped back, breaking the spell. It's getting late. I should head back before dark. Eleanor felt a sharp stab of disappointment, but nodded. Of course. Thank you again. I'll be back tomorrow to check on things, Caleb said. Keep your rifle close. He disappeared into the forest, leaving Eleanor standing in the gathering dusk with her heart beating faster than it should and her thoughts in pleasant turmoil. She touched her fingers to her lips, remembering the way he'd said her name, remembering the warmth in his eyes. Dangerous territory indeed. The attacks escalated over the following week. Eleanor woke one morning to find her garden completely destroyed, every plant torn up by the roots and trampled into the mud. 2 days after that, someone cut a section of fence, allowing her cows to wander off. It took Eleanor and Caleb most of a day to round them up. The night after that, someone fired shots over the cabin while Eleanor huddled inside with her rifle, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. True to his word, Caleb appeared every day. Sometimes he stayed for hours, sometimes just long enough to ensure everything was secure. His presence became a constant in Eleanor's life, something she began to rely on without quite meaning to. They worked side by side, talked about everything and nothing, shared meals at Eleanor's rough-hewn table. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls Eleanor had built around herself began to crumble. She learned that Caleb had grown up in Tennessee, that he'd lost his entire family to sickness before the war, that his time as a scout had taught him to read the land the way most people read books. She learned that he was 34 years old, that he'd been living alone in the mountains for almost a decade, that he trapped and hunted and occasionally guided wealthy men on expeditions through the high country. In turn, Eleanor found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. The fear she'd felt watching her father drink himself to death, the bone-deep loneliness of burying her brother, the fierce determination to make something of herself, to prove that a woman alone could survive and even thrive in this hard country. "You've already proved it," Caleb said one evening, as they sat on Eleanor's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Anyone with eyes can see you're thriving." "Then why does everyone in Silver Ridge treat me like I'm either a fool or a fallen woman?" Eleanor couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "Because you scare them," Caleb said simply. "You're everything they're not. Brave, independent, unbending. People don't like being reminded of their own cowardice." Eleanor turned to look at him, struck by the insight. "Is that why you left civilization? Because people's cowardice bothered you?" "Partially." Caleb stretched his long legs out, his shoulder nearly brushing Eleanor's. "Mostly because I was tired of pretending to be something I wasn't. The mountains don't care if you follow social conventions. If they only care if you're strong enough to survive them." "And are you?" Eleanor asked softly. "Strong enough?" Caleb's ice-blue eyes found hers in the fading light. "I was. But lately, I'm beginning to think that surviving alone isn't the same as truly living." Eleanor's breath caught. There was something in his voice and the way he looked at her that made her pulse race. What changed? "I met a woman too proud for her own good," Caleb said, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "A woman who matches that pride with pure, stubborn courage. Made me realize what I've been missing, living alone up in the high country." "And what's that?" Eleanor whispered, though she already knew the answer. "Connection. Partnership. Someone worth fighting for." Caleb shifted slightly, turning to face her more fully. "Someone worth coming down from the mountain for." Eleanor's heart was hammering now, her hands trembling slightly. "Caleb, I don't know how to do this. I've spent so long taking care of myself, being alone. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else." "Neither do I," Caleb admitted. "But I'd like to try, if you would." For a long moment, Eleanor simply looked at him, this massive, quiet man who'd somehow slipped past all her defenses. She thought about the way he'd stood beside her against Blackwood's threats, the way he handled her broken tomato plants with such gentle care, the way he looked at her pride and saw strength instead of flaw. "I'd like that," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, his large, calloused hand cupped her cheek with surprising tenderness. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and Eleanor's eyes fluttered closed at the sensation. She'd been touched so rarely in her life, and never like this, never with such obvious affection. "Eleanor," Caleb murmured, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and questioning. Eleanor made a small sound in her throat and kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent, and Eleanor felt something inside her that had been frozen for years suddenly crack and melt. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you standing in your yard, refusing to be intimidated by anything or anyone." Eleanor laughed shakily. "I've wanted you to do it since you saved my tomato plants. I think that's when I realized you saw me differently than everyone else does." "I see you clearly," Caleb said, "and what I see is magnificent." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple sincerity in his words. No one had ever called her magnificent before. Strange, difficult, unnatural, yes, but never magnificent. They sat together on the porch as stars began to emerge overhead, Eleanor tucked against Caleb's side with his arm around her shoulders. It felt natural, right? As if she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment without knowing it. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future that included something more than simple survival. A future with someone beside her. A future built on mutual respect and matched pride. When the spell was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Caleb was on his feet instantly, his rifle in his hands, his body positioned between Eleanor and the trail. Eleanor grabbed her own rifle and stood beside him, refusing to cower. 4 riders emerged from the darkness, and Eleanor's stomach sank when she recognized Silas Blackwood in the lead. The mining magnate reined his horse to a stop at the edge of Eleanor's yard, his face shadowed in the dim light from the cabin windows. "Miss Hartwell," Blackwood said, his voice carrying an edge of steel, "I see you've acquired a guard dog." "Careful how you talk about your betters, Blackwood," Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. "Might be you'll find yourself in more trouble than you bargained for." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Caleb Thorne, I should have known you'd stick your nose into business that doesn't concern you." "Any business that involves threatening a woman concerns me," Caleb replied, "especially when that woman is under my protection." Eleanor's chest swelled with warmth at his words, even as her hands tightened on her rifle. She stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Caleb. "I've told you before, Mr. Blackwood, this land is not for sale, not for $1,000, not for $10,000. It belonged to my family, and it will continue to belong to me." "I've tried being reasonable," Blackwood said, his voice hardening. "I've made you fair offers, but you refuse to see sense. That creek is vital to my mining operations. I can't have some stubborn woman controlling access to my water supply." "The creek doesn't belong to you," Eleanor shot back. "Jean, and neither does this land. My father filed his claim legally, and I've maintained it. You have no right to try to force me out." "Rights," Blackwood laughed, the sound ugly in the darkness. "Rights don't mean much out here, Miss Hartwell. Power means something, money means something, and I have both." "And I have a woman brave enough to stand against you," Caleb said, "and I happen to think that's worth more than all your money and power combined. So here's what's going to happen, Blackwood. You're going to ride out of here and leave Miss Hartwell alone. You're going to stop sending your men to harass her. And if I hear of any more threats, any more property damage, any more intimidation of any kind, I'm going to make sure every prospector and miner in the territory knows what kind of man you really are." "Is that a threat?" Blackwood's voice was dangerous. "It's a promise," Caleb replied calmly. "I spent 10 years scouting in some of the roughest country on this continent. I know men from here to the Mississippi. I know how to spread word faster than any newspaper. Your reputation is built on being tough but fair. What do you think happens when people find out you terrorize lone women to steal their land?" Blackwood's face flushed dark with anger. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Thorne." "I've made worse," Caleb said. "Now get off Miss Hartwell's property before I decide you're trespassing and act accordingly." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Eleanor could feel the potential for violence hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. Her finger hovered near the trigger of her rifle, her heart pounding. Then Blackwood yanked his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes," Eleanor said clearly, finding her voice. "It is. You will not set foot on my property again, Mr. Blackwood. If you do, I'll shoot you for trespassing, and then I'll take great pleasure in telling everyone exactly why." Blackwood stared at her, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something like uncertainty in his eyes. Then he spurred his horse forward, his men following. They disappeared into the darkness, hoofbeats gradually fading. Eleanor's legs suddenly felt weak. She would have stumbled, but Caleb's arm came around her waist, supporting her. "Easy," he murmured. "You did well. You didn't back down." "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted, her voice shaking. "Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway." Caleb turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You were magnificent, Eleanor. Absolutely magnificent." Eleanor laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "That's the second time you've called me that tonight. I'll probably call you that 1,000 more times before I'm done," Caleb said, and despite everything, Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest. They went inside, barring the door securely. Eleanor made coffee with shaking hands, while Caleb checked every window, every possible entry point. When he was satisfied, he sat down at the table across from her. "I'm staying tonight," he said, and it wasn't a question. "No, I don't trust Blackwood not to try something once he's had time to work himself into a fury." Eleanor should have protested, should have worried about propriety, about what people would say if they knew a man had spent the night in her cabin. But she was tired of caring what people thought, tired of being alone, tired of constantly looking over her shoulder. "All right," she said, "thank you." Caleb gave her a small smile. "You can have the bed. I'll take the floor." "Don't be ridiculous. You'll never fit comfortably on the floor." Eleanor gestured to his considerable height. "We're both adults. We can share the bed without impropriety." Something flashed in Caleb's ice-blue eyes, something hot and promising, but he simply nodded. "If you're sure." "I'm sure," Eleanor said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. They finished their coffee in companionable silence, then prepared for bed. Eleanor changed into her nightgown behind a screen, while Caleb removed his boots and outer shirt. When she emerged, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed in just his undershirt and pants, and the sight of his powerful arms and broad chest made her mouth go dry. They lay down together, maintaining a careful distance at first. But the bed was narrow, built for one person, and gravity inevitably pulled them together. Eleanor found herself nestled against Caleb's side, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. His heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear, and the warmth of his body seeped into her bones. "Caleb," she whispered into the darkness. What happens now? With Blackwood, I mean. Wait, do you really think he'll back down?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I think we hurt his pride tonight. A man like that doesn't take kindly to being challenged, especially in front of his men. But I also think he knows that going after you now would look bad. Too obvious. He might try something more subtle, but the direct intimidation should stop. And if it doesn't, then we'll deal with it together." Caleb's arm tightened around her. "You're not alone anymore, Eleanor. Not if you don't want to be." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. She'd been alone for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone on her side. "I don't want to be alone anymore." "Good," Caleb murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Neither do I." Eleanor fell asleep feeling safer than she had in years. Wrapped in the arms of a mountain man who loved her pride instead of condemning it, who saw her strength instead of her strangeness. For the first time since her brother died, she allowed herself to hope for something more than mere survival. She allowed herself to dream of a future built on more than just stubborn determination. She allowed herself to dream of love. Morning came softly, sunlight filtering through the cabin windows and painting everything gold. Eleanor woke to find herself still tucked against Caleb's side, his arm heavy across her waist. He was already awake, watching her with an expression so tender it made her heart ache. "Morning," she whispered. "Morning," Caleb replied, his voice rough with sleep. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Eleanor admitted. Maybe years." Caleb smiled and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. "Me too." They lay there for a few minutes longer, neither quite willing to break the peaceful spell of morning. Then reality intruded in the form of Eleanor's milk cows lowing insistently, reminding her that chores waited for no one. They rose and went about the business of starting the day. Caleb helped Eleanor with the morning tasks, moving around her property as if he'd been doing it for years rather than weeks. There was something deeply satisfying about working beside him, about the unspoken coordination that had developed between them. I need to head back to my place today, Caleb said over breakfast. I've been neglecting things and I have traps I need to check, but I'll be back tomorrow. And I'll keep an eye out for any signs of trouble. Eleanor nodded, trying not to show her disappointment. Of course, you've already done so much. Eleanor? Caleb reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. I'm not abandoning you. I'm just taking care of necessary business. But I meant what I said last night. You're not alone anymore. I know, Eleanor said, squeezing his fingers. I trust you. The words felt momentous, significant beyond their simple meaning. Trust was something Eleanor had learned to withhold, to guard jealously. Offering it to Caleb felt like handing him a piece of her soul. Caleb seemed to understand the weight of her words. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I won't betray that trust, ever. He left an hour later, but not before thoroughly checking the property one more time and making Eleanor promise to keep her rifle close. Eleanor watched him disappear into the forest, already missing him, already counting the hours until she'd see him again. She threw herself into work, trying to keep her mind occupied, but her thoughts kept drifting back to ice-blue eyes and gentle hands, to the feeling of being held through the night, to the promise of something more than endless loneliness. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work and growing affection. Caleb appeared every few days, sometimes staying for hours, sometimes for days at a time. He helped Eleanor prepare for winter, cutting firewood and reinforcing the barn. They worked on replacing the destroyed garden with cold-resistant crops that might survive an early frost. They spent evenings talking on the porch or sitting by the fire, sharing stories and dreams. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Eleanor discovered that Caleb had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. She learned that he was a talented carpenter, that he could track an animal across solid rock, that he played a battered harmonica with surprising skill. She learned the taste of his mouth and the feel of his hands in her hair, the sound he made low in his throat when she kissed him. Caleb learned that Eleanor had a beautiful singing voice she rarely used, that she could outshoot most men, that she read everything she could get her hands on, and dreamed of someday writing a book about her experiences in the West. He learned the curve of her waist and the silk of her skin, and the way she sighed when he kissed her neck. They were falling in love. Both of them knew it, though neither had yet spoken the words aloud. It felt too new, too fragile, too precious to name. October arrived with the first real snowfall, a dusting of white that transformed the mountains into something magical. Eleanor woke one morning to find Caleb already at work outside, shoveling a path to the barn. She watched him through the window, admiring the play of muscles beneath his shirt, the easy strength with which he moved. She was making breakfast when he came inside, stamping snow from his boots. His cheeks were ruddy with cold, his dark hair damp with melting snowflakes. Eleanor found herself crossing the cabin and pulling him down for a kiss, not caring that he was cold and wet. Caleb made a sound of surprise that quickly turned into pleasure. His arms came around her, lifting her almost off her feet. The kiss deepened, grew heated, and Eleanor felt desire coil tight in her belly. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. Eleanor's heart stopped. "What?" "Marry me," Caleb repeated, his ice-blue eyes intense on hers. "I love you, Eleanor Hartwell. I love your pride and your courage and your stubborn refusal to back down. I love the way you stand up to bullies and save broken plants and sing when you think no one's listening. I want to spend my life beside you, working this land, facing whatever comes together. Marry me." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too. I didn't think I could, didn't think I knew how. But I do. I love you so much it terrifies me." "Is that a yes?" Caleb asked, a smile playing at his lips. "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Caleb kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful restraint. His hands roamed over her body, and Eleanor arched into his touch, wanting more, wanting everything. They made their way to the bed in a tangle of limbs and shed clothing, and Eleanor gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, skin to skin, hearts beating in synchrony. Caleb traced lazy patterns on Eleanor's back, and she pressed kisses to his chest, tasting salt and warmth. "When?" she asked eventually. "When should we marry?" "As soon as possible," Caleb said. "I don't want to spend another night away from you." "We'll go into Silver Ridge tomorrow, find the preacher, make it official." Eleanor laughed. "The town gossips will have a field day." "Let them talk," Caleb said. "We'll be too busy living our lives to care." They married 3 days later, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Silver Ridge. Eleanor wore her best dress, dark blue calico that she'd carefully mended and pressed. Caleb had trimmed his beard and pulled his dark hair back, though he still looked more wild than civilized. Mrs. Adelaide Perkins and her circle of gossips attended, their faces tight with disapproval, but Eleanor didn't care. She spoke her vows clearly, her hand steady in Caleb's, her eyes locked on his ice-blue gaze. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Caleb kissed her thoroughly, scandalizing half the congregation. Eleanor kissed him back, not caring who saw, not caring what they thought. For the first time in her life, she felt completely free, completely herself, completely loved. They rode back to the homestead together, Caleb on his massive roan horse and Eleanor in her wagon. The afternoon was clear and cold, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. Snow clung to the higher peaks, and Eleanor could smell winter in the air. "We should spend the cold months at your place," Eleanor said as they traveled. "It's higher and more sheltered than mine, better positioned for winter." "Our place," Caleb corrected. "Everything I have is yours now, Eleanor, and we'll split our time between both properties. Your father's claim is still yours to maintain, and I won't let you abandon it." Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest. He understood, without her having to explain, how important it was for her to keep her independence, her own stake in this land. "Thank you." "Nothing to thank me for," Caleb said. "We're partners now, equals. That's how this works." They spent the winter at Caleb's cabin in the high country, and Eleanor discovered a peace she'd never known existed. The cabin was larger than hers, built with obvious skill and care. It had a massive stone fireplace, a loft for sleeping, and windows positioned to capture every bit of available light. Caleb had built it himself over the course of several years, shaping it to fit his needs and wants. The snow came early and stayed late, isolating them from the rest of the world. But Eleanor didn't mind. She and Caleb fell into an easy rhythm, sharing chores and meals, spending long evenings by the fire. They talked about everything, their pasts, and their hopes for the future, the life they wanted to build together. Caleb taught Eleanor how to read the weather in the mountains, how to predict a blizzard days before it arrived. He showed her the best places to trap and hunt, the hidden hot springs where they could bathe even in the depths of winter. He made love to her with passionate intensity, teaching her body pleasures she'd never imagined. Eleanor taught Caleb about books and poetry, reading aloud by firelight while he worked on various projects. She showed him how to make proper bread instead of the tough biscuits he'd been surviving on. She challenged him at chess and checkers, delighting when she won, graciously accepting defeat when she didn't. They were happy in a way neither had ever expected to be, content in their isolated paradise. But paradise couldn't last forever. For spring came eventually, melting the snow and opening the trails. In late March, they made the journey down to Eleanor's homestead to assess what repairs were needed and to check on the property. What they found made Eleanor's blood run cold. The cabin had been ransacked. Windows were broken, the door hung from its hinges. Inside, furniture had been overturned and smashed, her carefully preserved food supplies scattered and ruined. Someone had taken an axe to the table Caleb had helped her repair. The walls bore scorch marks, as if someone had tried to set the place on fire but given up. Eleanor stood in the ruins of her home, tears streaming down her face, all her hard work, all her determination reduced to wreckage. She felt Caleb's arm come around her shoulders, solid and comforting. "Blackwood," she said, her voice thick with grief and rage. "Probably," Caleb agreed. "He waited until he thought you'd given up and left for good." "What do we do?" Eleanor turned to look at her husband, this strong man who'd stood beside her through everything. "How do we fight this?" Caleb's expression was grim. "We rebuild. And then we make sure Blackwood understands that you're not going anywhere, and that attacking your property is the same as attacking both of us." They spent the next 2 weeks working from dawn to dark, repairing the damage. Caleb's carpentry skills proved invaluable as he rebuilt furniture, rehung doors, replaced broken windows. Eleanor cleaned and scrubbed, working out her anger through physical labor. Other people helped too, surprising Eleanor. Old Mr. Brennan from the general store arrived with supplies, refusing payment. A few of the other homesteaders in the area showed up to lend their labor, men and women who'd been watching Eleanor struggle alone and now seemed relieved that she had someone beside her. Even the town blacksmith contributed, forging new hinges and latches for the damaged doors. "Folks around here have been talking," Mr. Brennan told Eleanor as they worked. "Most of us don't care much for Blackwood and his bullying ways. Hearing about what he did to your place made people angry. You've got more friends than you realize, Miss Hartwell." "Excuse me, Mrs. Thorne." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. She'd spent so long thinking everyone in Silver Ridge despised her, judged her, wanted her gone. To discover that she'd been wrong, that there were people who admired her determination, was overwhelming. When the cabin was finally restored, Caleb insisted on staying there for a few days to establish their presence. On the third night, just after dark, they heard horses approaching. But this time, Caleb was prepared. He'd set snares and alarms all around the property, and he'd alerted several of the neighboring homesteaders to what was happening. 6 men approached the cabin, Silas Blackwood in the lead. But before they could reach the yard, lanterns flared to life all around them. A dozen men stepped out of the darkness, rifles raised. Caleb and Eleanor stood on the porch, armed and ready. "That's far enough, Blackwood," Caleb called out. "You're surrounded and outgunned. I suggest you turn around and leave while you still can." Blackwood's face twisted with rage. "This is none of your concern, Thorne. This is between me and the woman." "The woman is my wife," Caleb said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air, "which makes it very much my concern. And apparently, it's also the concern of every decent person in this valley who's tired of watching you bully and steal." "I'm not stealing anything," Blackwood protested. "I've made fair offers." "Fair?" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice ringing with anger. "You call harassment and property destruction fair? You call threatening a woman alone fair?" "I don't think so, Mr. Blackwood. And apparently, neither do your neighbors." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered men. Blackwood looked around, seeming to realize for the first time that he'd badly miscalculated. These weren't frightened townspeople or hired thugs. These were hardened homesteaders and miners, men who'd carved their lives out of unforgiving rock and weren't about to tolerate injustice. "The law will hear about this," Blackwood blustered. "Good," Caleb said. "Let's go to town right now and tell the sheriff what you did to my wife's property. Let's have a nice public conversation about your business practices. I'm sure everyone would be fascinated to hear how you operate." Blackwood's face flushed dark with fury, but he wasn't stupid. He knew when he'd been beaten. "This isn't over," he growled. "Yes, it is," Eleanor said firmly. "You will leave me and my property alone, Mr. Blackwood. If you don't, every person here will testify to your harassment. Your reputation will be ruined and your business will suffer. Is access to one creek really worth that?" For a long moment, Blackwood simply stared at her. Then something in his expression changed, a kind of grudging respect entering his eyes. "You're a formidable woman, Mrs. Thorne. Your husband is a lucky man." "I know," Caleb said, and Eleanor could hear the smile in his voice. Blackwood wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. The gathered homesteaders lowered their rifles, and someone started laughing. Soon everyone was laughing, the tension breaking like a snapped rope. "I think that's the last we'll see of Blackwood's harassment," Mr. Brennan said, grinning. "Man's too smart to push when he knows he's beat." The men gradually dispersed, returning to their own homes with promises to keep an eye out for trouble. Eleanor and Caleb stood alone in their yard watching the stars emerge overhead. "We did it," Eleanor whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "We actually stood up to him and won." "We did," Caleb agreed, pulling her close. "Because you refused to back down, and because people saw that courage and wanted to support it. You're remarkable, Eleanor Thorne." Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at him in the starlight. "We're remarkable together." Caleb kissed her, and Eleanor poured everything she felt into that kiss, love and gratitude and fierce joy. She'd come to this land alone, determined to prove she could survive. But she'd found something so much better than mere survival. She'd found partnership, community, and love. She'd found home. The years that followed were filled with hard work and deep contentment. Eleanor and Caleb split their time between the two homesteads, building both properties into thriving concerns. They raised cattle and horses, kept bees, expanded Eleanor's garden into something productive enough to sell surplus vegetables in town. Caleb continued to trap and guide, while Eleanor began writing her book about life in the West, recording the stories of the women she met along the way. True to his word, Silas Blackwood left them alone. He eventually sold his mining operation and moved to Denver, worn down by age and the changing times. Other miners and homesteaders moved into the valley, and Silver Ridge grew from a rough camp into a proper town. The gossips never quite stopped talking about Eleanor, but their disapproval gradually shifted to grudging admiration. In the spring of 1878, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a robust boy with his father's ice-blue eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. They named him Thomas, after Eleanor's brother, and Caleb cried when he held his son for the first time, great silent tears that spoke of joy too deep for words. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, dark-haired and fierce even as an infant. They named her Sarah, after Caleb's mother, and Eleanor marveled at the way her massive, powerful husband could be so achingly gentle with their tiny daughter. A third child, another boy, was born in the winter of 1883. They named him James, and he had auburn hair like his mother and his father's quiet strength. Their family grew and thrived, filling both cabins with laughter and love. Eleanor's book was published in 1885, creating a modest sensation in the East where people were fascinated by stories of Western women. She received letters from women all over the country, thanking her for showing that female strength and independence weren't things to be ashamed of. Eleanor answered every letter, encouraging those women to find their own courage, to stand proud no matter what society expected. Caleb read the book with obvious pride, though he laughed at how she'd portrayed him. "You make me sound like some kind of hero," he said. "You are my hero," Eleanor replied. "You saw my pride and loved it instead of trying to break it. You stood beside me instead of trying to stand over me. That's heroic, Caleb Thorne." The children grew, strong and healthy and filled with their parents' independent spirit. Thomas became a skilled tracker like his father, able to read the mountains as easily as breathing. Sarah developed her mother's fierce determination and announced at age 12 that she intended to become a doctor, propriety be damned. James, the quietest of the three, showed a gift for working with animals that surprised everyone. On their 20th wedding anniversary in October of 1896, Eleanor and Caleb sat on the porch of the high country cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Their children were grown now, making their own ways in the world. Thomas had married a spirited young woman from Denver and was establishing his own homestead further north. Sarah was in medical school in Philadelphia, writing long letters full of excitement and determination. James was managing both family properties, content in his quiet stewardship of the land. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked, her head resting on Caleb's shoulder. "Choosing a life with me instead of your solitary existence in the mountains?" Caleb was silent for a moment, and Eleanor could feel the steady beat of his heart. He'd aged well, his dark hair now liberally streaked with silver, his face lined but still strong. His body had thickened slightly with the years, but he remained powerful, capable, a man the mountains hadn't managed to break. "Not once," he said finally. "You gave me everything I didn't know I needed, Eleanor. Purpose, partnership, love, a family. I lived alone in these mountains for years, and I thought that was enough. But meeting you, loving you, building this life with you, I understand now what I was missing. I was surviving. With you, I've been truly living." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. 20 years of happiness distilled into this perfect moment. "I love you," she whispered. "I loved you then, when you looked at my pride and saw strength. I love you now, after 20 years of partnership. I'll love you until the day I die." Caleb turned her face up to his and kissed her with the same passion he'd shown on their wedding day. Some things never changed. Some things only grew stronger with time. They said you were too proud for your own good, Caleb murmured against her lips. But I knew the truth from the beginning. What truth? Eleanor asked, though she'd heard this particular statement many times over the years. It had become a kind of ritual between them, an affirmation of what they'd built together. That your pride was exactly right for you, Caleb said, his ice-blue eyes warm with love. That you needed someone who matched it instead of trying to diminish it, that we were meant to find each other in this wild, hard, beautiful country, and that loving your pride meant loving all of you exactly as you are. Eleanor smiled, her heart full to overflowing. They said I was too proud. But you loved me anyway. No, Caleb corrected gently. I loved you because of it. Your pride, your strength, your stubborn refusal to be anything other than yourself. That's what I fell in love with, Eleanor Thorne, and I'd do it all over again, 1,000 times. They sat together as stars began to emerge, marking the familiar constellations. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging. But Eleanor and Caleb had changed them too, in small but significant ways. They'd built homes here, raised children, or created a legacy of courage and determination that would echo through generations. Eleanor thought about the young woman she'd been, standing in Silver Ridge with her chin raised and her pride intact despite the whispers and judgment. She thought about how alone she'd felt, how certain she'd been that she would spend her entire life fighting against a world that wanted to break her. She'd been wrong, not about the fighting that had proven necessary, but about being alone, because she'd found Caleb, this mountain man who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. And together they'd built something more enduring than any individual pride or stubborn independence. They'd built partnership, understanding, a love that grew stronger with each passing year. Tell me about tomorrow, Eleanor said, a request she often made in their quiet moments together. Caleb knew what she meant, not the literal tomorrow, but the future they were still building together. Tomorrow we'll wake in this cabin we built together. We'll tend the land we've carved out of the wilderness. We'll write letters to our children and anticipate the grandchildren they'll surely give us. We'll work side by side as we have for 20 years, partners in everything. And when night comes, I'll hold you close and thank whatever power brought you into my life. That sounds perfect, Eleanor whispered. That sounds like us, Caleb corrected. They sat together until the cold drove them inside, but even then they stayed close, as they always did. They'd faced down claim jumpers and bullies, blizzards and hardship, isolation and judgment. They'd survived it all because they'd survived it together, two proud, stubborn people who refused to bend for anyone except each other. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the mountains stood sentinel under a sky blazing with stars. Inside, Eleanor and Caleb Thorne held each other close, grateful for every day, every moment, every heartbeat of the life they'd built together. They'd started as two solitary souls, each convinced they were better off alone. They'd become partners, then lovers, then husband and wife, then parents. Through it all, they'd maintained the pride that first attracted them to each other, but they'd learned to temper it with compromise, to strengthen it with mutual support, to enrich it with love. She's too proud for her own good, the townspeople had said. Nay, but Caleb Thorne had looked at Eleanor Hartwell's pride and seen something precious, something worth matching rather than breaking. And in doing so, he'd given her the greatest gift imaginable, someone who loved all of her exactly as she was. As Eleanor drifted off to sleep that night, wrapped in her husband's arms with 20 years of memories behind her and an open future ahead, she thought about the scared, angry, determined young woman she'd been. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would work out, that love was possible, that pride didn't have to mean loneliness. But then again, that young woman had possessed exactly the pride and courage necessary to survive until she met her match. She'd needed to be that proud, that stubborn, that unbending. Because only someone with that kind of strength could have built the life Eleanor now lived, could have stood beside Caleb as an equal, could have created this legacy of independence and love. The mountains had tested them both, separately and together. But they'd passed every test, overcome every obstacle, built something beautiful out of harsh reality, They'd taken pride and courage and determination, and they'd forged it all into love. And love, Eleanor thought as sleep finally claimed her, love matched well with pride. Love strengthened it, refined it, gave it purpose beyond simple survival. Love made pride into something transcendent. The last thing Eleanor heard before sleep took her completely was Caleb's voice, rough and tender, whispering the words he said every night. I love you, my proud, magnificent wife. Today, tomorrow, and always. And Eleanor, secure in the knowledge that she was loved exactly as she was, smiled and slipped into dreams of mountains and starlight, of strong arms and ice-blue eyes, of a future that held nothing but promise. She'd been too proud for her own good, they'd said. But Caleb Thorne had loved her pride and matched it well. And together, they'd built something extraordinary in the wild, hard, beautiful West, something that would endure long after they were gone, carried forward by the children they'd raised and the legacy they'd created. Something called love, something called home, something called forever.